The future is unknown. What lies ahead is uncharted. What will connected industry be like? How can our democracies become fairer and more participatory? Might algorithms be sexist? What sensors will we wear on our clothing? How will we ensure sustainable development in our cities? How can new technologies improve the lives of older people? Will we be able to accelerate communication between machines? The IN3 works to understand and build our future society. Internet studies at this pioneering research center located in Barcelona and part of the UOC have a global impact. It researches the digital transformation of society and designs social and technological solutions for future challenges. The IN3 has 130 researchers who make up 11 inter- and transdisciplinary research groups. Together, they have published 1,500 scientific articles, working with universities in over 40 different countries. IN3, 20 years shaping the future internet.
Professor Castells, rector, autoritats acadèmiques, col·legues. It is an honor for me to open this event with a twofold celebration. On the one hand, we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the publication of the first volume of Professor Castells' renowned Trilogy on the Information Age. On the other hand, we are also here to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the IN3. Please let me provide a few words to join these two happy celebrations. In the first volume of his trilogy, Professor Manuel Castells, founder and principal investigator at the IN3, said, "The promise of the information age is the unleashing of unprecedented productive capacity by the power of the mind. I think, therefore I produce. In so doing, we will have the leisure to experiment with spirituality and the opportunity of reconciliation with nature, without sacrificing the material well-being of our children. The dream of the Enlightenment that reason and science would solve the problems of humankind is within reach." The transformative power of the interaction between digital technologies and human activities is undeniable. Knowledge, the power of the mind, to quote Professor Castells, has become the engine of the current hyper-digitized societies. We could say that knowledge is the most important superpower in today's societies. But as noted in the Peter Parker principle in the Spider-Man comics, with great power there must also come great responsibility. The IN3 was created 20 years ago to focus on the network society, or in other words, the interaction between technologies and human activity. This research is carried out thanks to the convergence of different disciplines, such as social and human sciences and ICT engineering. Interdisciplinary cooperation plays a key role in our attempts to fulfill Professor Castells' prophecy. Here are some examples of how the interaction between society and technology has changed in these 20 years. In the year 2000, we didn't have Twitter, WhatsApp, or Facebook. There were no smartphones or tablets. Home and mobile internet connection offered just a few dozen kilobits per second. Netflix sold DVD by mail. Amazon was not making profit. Streaming was uncommon, and video conferencing was used only at work. Over these 20 years, the IN3's research has contributed to social and technological transformation in various areas, such as the new economy algorithms and logistics applied in e-commerce, gender-related issues of ICT, wireless sensor networks, the role of mobile devices in society, and many more aspects. We can therefore say that the IN3 has been shaping the future internet for 20 years, while contributing to the progress of society. But what about the next 20 years? Returning to Peter Parker principle, the IN3 has a great responsibility to contribute to the Enlightenment dream to solve the problems of mankind through science. For this reason, we have aligned our research goals with the United Nations 2030 Agenda and placed the Sustainable Development Goals at the center of our work. Overcoming the gender gap, contributing to technological breakthroughs in the information society and industry, moving towards more sustainable and environmentally responsible urban and social models, and working to reduce inequality are some of the areas that provide the focus and must guide our research. The challenges that humanity will have to face in the coming years are enormous. The time for urgent action is running out. Hopefully, it is not too late for us to get on the right track. Now, I will give the floor to our colleague, Professor Manuel Castells, to present his conference in this event. So, Manuel, please, welcome.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. Dear colleagues, let me first thank all of you for attending this special seminar, which I hope will be intellectually fruitful and interesting for all of us, certainly for me. Allow me, without being too formal, to thank very deeply the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya because of their interest in organizing this symposium. I'm extremely happy to be here today in what is one of, has been for many years and to some extent still is, my intellectual home. And I want to personalize these thanks in the rector, Dr. Josep Ranells, who has covered all this research and activity and has supported the organization of this seminar and has strengthened the intellectual relationship that we have had over the years, personally and institutionally. And certainly my dear colleagues, Mireia Fernández Ardèvol and Ramon Rivera, professors and researchers at the Institute for Interdisciplinary Study of the Internet, IN3, who took the initiative years ago of organizing this symposium in the context of the 20th anniversary of the creation of the Research Institute, but coincided with the publication, in fact, of the last volume of my Trilogy, 3 years, 96, 2000. And I really I'm very grateful to them, not only for their original interest, because they kept the project and the idea of organizing this symposium through the pandemics, which is quite remarkable. And I am particularly grateful to all the two of them, and I hope that this symposium will lead to further development of our collaboration. Let me use these minutes of introduction to rethink, to some extent, the connection between the theory of the network society that conceptualized about 20 years ago and current developments. Some of you know that for me, in epistemological terms, the theory is a good theory when and only when it becomes useful to understand reality, to understand the matter in its diversity, and in the case of social sciences, the living conscious matter. So, to a large extent, all the other things are mediations. Ultimately, the test for a good theory is if it is a good tool to understand, and for those of us who would like or feel committed to transform society. I still believe in the inscription in Marsh's tomb in Highgate Cemetery. In the preface of the 2010 edition of the Network Society, I wrote a long text on trying to see in the 10 years that had passed between the publication and this new edition, what had happened and how this could be, to some extent, in retrospect, explained or at least clarified by the concepts and the hypotheses contained in the book on the Network Society. Now, 10 years later, and with much less care, because my current duties make difficult to have the same kind of in-depth reflection for a long time, but I would like to do a similar exercise, what happened in the last 10 years and what is happening now, and see how much the theory of the Network Society helps us to understand or not current developments. Simply to remind you that in my theory, the network societies, very precise, is the social structure of our age, the information age. And because it is a global social structure, it refers to all societies, although with extreme cultural and institutional diversity, depending on the context in which this theory, this social structure manifests itself. It's to some extent similar with the use of the concept of industrial society, in which at the same time there is some common nucleus, and at the same time institutional and cultural diversity, depending on countries and space and time. Of course, the existence and deployment of the network society does not supersede capitalism, quite the contrary. In many areas of the world, we are in the most capitalist society that we have ever been, but it's a different axis. It's not the same. The network society refers to the social structure, capitalism refers to the structure of the social appropriation of production and wealth. The fundamental nucleus of our time is constituted around this network society, in which not everybody is included, because networks, remember always, include and exclude at the same time. However, the exclusion is also a derivative of the logic of network inclusion. It's the same process seen from two different points of the networking logic. Well, this is simply a reminder, just in case we have stopped the discussion on the basic concept, not to have to reassess this matter. Let me first identify some changes in the theory in continuity with what was the nucleus of the theory. As Professor David Mejias, the director of IN3, mentioned, it's extraordinary the development of the technological, social, cultural transformation in the last 20 years, and I would say in the last 10 years. Internet-based social networks have become the platform of everything, of sociability, of literally everything. And all activities have been basically digitized. At the nucleus of every human activity, there is a digital network that connects to other digital networks. This is, frankly, I don't predict. I try to predict the past. It's safer. But what I could see very early on is that the logic, the expanding logic of these networks and the impact on different levels of the social structure, we're going to be increasingly able to comprehend all activities, all processes, really, of everything we do. At the same time, therefore, we have seen a widespread extension of these network platforms and an acceleration in terms of its ability to increase volume, speed, and latency in terms of the relationship between these networks. Concretely speaking, I think now, we have the full expansion of artificial intelligence, which until now was kind of science fiction, promise, possibility. Now that's it. It's spreading all over and fundamentally transforming much of what we do. The famous notion of the expansion of databases and data as the key element in society. Data without artificial intelligence is nothing. So when we say data, we say artificial intelligence at the same time. And in terms of the communication, in terms of the theory, literally, the 5G transforms everything. It's not more speed or more volume, more capacity, more latency. It's qualitatively different. And the combination of both is what is truly transforming everything we do. And so we know that social movements are transformed, as I have tried to argue in several empirically grounded books, as well as counter-social movements. Politics is transformed. It has become essentially media politics and informational politics, another part of my later research, my book, Communication Power. At the same time, territorial transformation has been considerable. This type of global networking of the entire economy and all the activities have translated in territorial terms in the formation of new spatial forms, what I call metropolitan regions, or the gigantic expanses of territorial expanses of territories in which everything happens at the same time with extreme processes of concentration, dispersion, accumulation of wealth and power, and widespread marginality. We are increasingly in a massively urbanized planet, which already the majority of the population live in cities, a substantial proportion live in mega metropolitan regions, and by the year 2050, which is not so far away, about 80% of the planet will be urbanized. So the process is accelerating rapidly. And at the same time, the populations of the world are dramatically shifting in terms of the ethnic, political, geopolitical, and cultural makeup. I just remind you, for my European friends, that the population of Europe at this point is just Europe, all of Europe, 6% of the world population. We should reflect a little bit about that, because the mind frame doesn't adapt easily to such tectonic changes. In this process of marginal mega-urbanization has been linked directly to the breakdown of the social fabric in many areas of the world, which social solidarity disappearing, survival struggle and massive individualization only the family becomes some refuge, but everything else increasingly disintegrates. Extreme individualism, which is pushed and favored both by marginality and by the extreme liberal individualistic ideology, which links with poverty and massive marginality to the emergence of what I identified years ago as the globally networked criminal economy as one of the key segments of both society, economy, and institutional crisis. There are, in this sense, and at the same time, identified in my trilogy, a resistance to the logic of networks. Not everything is being taken by the logic of networks, but also by the reaction to the networks and to the dominance of the networks, the affirmation of identities, identities that refuse to be dissolved by the logic of networks, identities based on religion, on sexual identity, on gender, on ethnic identity, on territorial identity. All this constituted an integral part of my theory from the beginning because I saw the two processes which I identified as the net and the self. And one key element which has not been truly developed either in my theory or in other theories I have seen is the increasing importance of the individual construction of specific identities, because all the identities that I identified are collective identities built on the materials of history. But there are also increasingly in all societies the self-definition of identity which further fragments society. Myself and my identity versus whatever. But in all cases, identities represent a reaction to the dissolving logic of the networks. All this is in line of what I have been discussing and has simply expanded, dramatically expanded, and to some extent showing relative usefulness of what I proposed years ago. But there have been key changes in my, I wouldn't say necessarily theory, but in the social observation of what I proceeded with the categories of my theory. One important change is to correct the, I would say, the romantic enthusiasm for the social networks at the beginning, which I share with my California libertarian culture at the time. Social networks, we should have known better. By being social networks of humans and being free communication networks, this continues to be so. They are free communication networks. But at the same time, they have expressed the contradictions, the fundamental contradictions of the human organization. Three, fundamentally. On the one hand, since capitalism is so expansive, it has deeply penetrated the logic of these social media networks and usher in data capitalism. We all know the old saying in Silicon Valley, you are not paying, you are paying with your data. And therefore, we all had been transformed into data. So on the one hand, yes, we are free to communicate more than ever, because the more we communicate freely, the more data we provide for free. And therefore, the political economy of data capitalism is one of the key segments. Just to illustrate one thing, 91% of Google revenue is linked to different forms of advertising. Advertising, which is not the traditional advertising, is the use of our data to focus messages, to targeting, to sell more or less legally. This is still in discussion. But clearly we all know that the free communication, the social platforms has become an instrument of gigantic capital accumulation based on the destruction of privacy. There is no privacy. If we use the networks, we systematically refuse to defend our privacy. There is no other way. The other thing is that, on the one hand, capital entered the logic of the networks. On the other hand, the other traditional system of restraint of liberty, the state, the old nemesis of society, the state. The state has found in the massive use of the social media networks a fantastic terrain for surveillance. So we are all sold and surveilled, clearly. And this is something which I have analyzed and theorized with my good friend and colleague John Thompson at Cambridge. We developed a whole paper on this notion of the twin developments of these contradictions as data capitalism on the one hand, and the formation of global surveillance bureaucracies, which are all interconnected and which have eliminated any possibility of escape to massive surveillance. I try to create some images by describing these big brother and little sisters, although the little sisters are not so little because they are Microsoft, Google, etc. The third issue, which has changed, again, not so much my theory, but the social consequences that I have seen in my theory, is that free communication networks have created the basis for the free expansion of human nature and of human attitudes, beliefs, and behavior. And gradually we discover that we are not necessarily good people, that humans are full of everything. We are angels or demons, and most of us are both angels and demons, depending on the day, the evening, the year, how we feel. And therefore, social networks that were the privileged platform for social movement, social change, the ability to create and imagine a new society, at the same time have become the repository of racism, sexism, Nazism, homophobic feelings, destruction of democracy, and more important than anything else, fake news. And therefore, the destruction of the idea of truth, the destruction of science, and therefore the new assault on reason. All this is amplified, developed by social networks, which are at the same time platforms of freedom, platforms of free communication, platforms of creativity, both things. And we have to recover the old logic of dialectics, that it's one and the other, the contradiction between both. And yes, theoretically, there's synthesis, but the synthesis is still not there. Within this, in terms of the development and the deployment of the theory of the network society, I then enter into the analysis of media politics as the fundamental form of politics in our world. My book, Communication Power, was, some people call it the fourth volume of my trilogy, because, of course, I saw the issues of power at the center of everything. But you know what? I didn't have time, because theoretically I was not going to have time. And therefore, the issue of power was so complicated that I leave it on the side. When I finally discovered that I had some more time left, then I went into the major attempt to identify the new mechanism of power, and that's my book, Communication Power, published in 2009, 2010, in which I identified media politics, informational politics, social media as key elements of power. And the derivative of this analysis, which I summarize in my book, rupture, the crisis of liberal democracies, showing the direct connection between this new kind of politics and the crisis of liberal democracies and the crisis of political hegemony, the political legitimacy, gigantic crisis of political legitimacy all throughout the world, in which, empirically speaking, more than 2/3 of citizens in the world, and in many countries, 70, 80%, do not believe in their political institutions, in their politicians, in their parties, in anything. They do believe in democracy, but not in this one. And this, of course, introduces a fundamental crisis, which is more important than the others, because if we don't have the tools, we don't believe in the tools to handle any of the other crises, we are orphans of institutions. And that's my anarchist feeling means that maybe there is a chance there, but anarchy is not chaos. The use of the word anarchy is really a defamation of the ideals of the anarchist philosophy, which is a new order created by consensus, not chaos, not what is called anarchy. And for the moment, we are on the chaos side. And this leads me to the other major emphasis linked to my theory, which is the fate of the state as the central actor throughout human history. The state supersedes the political economy, capital. The state is a permanent form of organization, repression, domination of human life. I never believe in the neoliberal ideologies, particularly expressed sometimes in the analysis of networks, that all this meant the supersession of the state, that there was globalization and nation states or states just disappear, dissolve. No, come on. We are seeing that dramatically. But even before that, what I analyzed was the transformation of the state into a different kind of a state, what I call the network state. The network state, which for me, the key example was the European Union, was a new form of a state in which all the nodes are important. Through first-hand observation, I can tell you that before we open the mouth in anything related to any government in Europe, is always what Brussels says about this. Brussels is the magic word that frames and changes everything, the way of thinking. Before we think about anything, we think about Brussels. Brussels has the power? Yes and no. No. Has money, although the money is from Germany, basically, but it's something else. It's a coordinating node of all the nodes that form the actual European state, which is a network state. Well, with some effort, we could think about other areas of the world in which also a network state of this kind has emerged. However, it's not exactly that, because at the same time, the state as such is not always network and has strengthened its power in terms of domination and control. I mentioned that surveillance and the end of privacy is comprehensive, and this has strengthened the dominant function of the state, the domination function. So not only the state has not dissolved, but has increased its capacity, because being able to enter all our minds and to some extent symbolically manipulate our minds is more powerful than ever, even if they are not always able to legally torture. Moreover, military confrontation and military intimidation and prevention, which is a key element of the state, violence and the state are linked throughout history. Well, artificial intelligence has already transformed the forms of confrontation between states and has deeply altered everything. For instance, the key element these days is confrontation between drones in swarming. We know the drones that surveil the world and shoot lasers and everything, but it's also the new tactics, which is already in the public domain, is swarms of thousands and thousands of drones attacking each other or attacking targets. Now, these drones, they only can work in this way through incredibly powerful mechanisms of artificial intelligence. And this example, I could extend. This is one of the things that I do at 3 a.m. in the night, try to study these things. We have, by the way, next week, a seminar in the Ministry of Defense of Spain about these matters, for you to see the diversity of my current activities. And this is one example, but the combination of all the possible uses of artificial intelligence, military technology means one thing. Wars have never been very human, of course. It's the destruction of humankind, destruction of humanity, the negation of ourselves, killing, or the threat of killing. Wars are also played in simulation models before actually going into practice, fortunately. But that means one thing. They have never been very human, but at this point they have been completely dehumanized. They are kids in the Nevada desert erasing from the earth one remote village in Yemen, or one big city in Yemen, with thousands of kids. Without saying anything, without feeling anything, that's a new switch. Not that we have robotized the world, we have robotized ourselves. And therefore, the notion of introducing humanistic discussions and concepts into the conduct of wars is the only way to countervail the transformation by networks of information and communication of the military activity, which is at the heart of the state. And then, of course, cyber wars today of all kinds, not only between states, but with corporations, with everybody, the manipulation of elections, as we know. Can you see the penetration of all these networks into the domination and activities of the state and the full transformation? We are going to be able, we have to, at this point, to protect every electoral process against the manipulation of this process by cyber attacks. So our cyber defenses or offenses have to be more powerful than ever. Is that the disappearance of the state or the strengthening of the state under new conditions? So by network state, it was a very nice notion of the diffusion of power, but networks in the state are a different thing, and they have strengthened the state extraordinarily. I would also say that this crisis of legitimacy and the fact that of these processes have increased the autonomy of state apparatuses as a state vis-à-vis politics and elected politicians. States are more and more isolated, insulated from the actual political game. And because politics, media politics, informational politics is a crisis of legitimacy, there has been an increasing shift from elected politics to the judicial system as the site of power, with increasing autonomy between elected politicians, elected governments, the state as an apparatus, and the judicial system as the power, the ultimate resort of power to cut across the increasing paralysis of the political system. And more than that, the worst of the worst, suddenly, in our world, non-democratic states that were supposed to be bureaucratic, inefficient, unable to function, are the most efficient states. Not the nicest, but the most efficient. China, just to take an example. Who has controlled the pandemics? China. Who is growing fast immediately afterwards? China. Repressive state? Absolutely. Effective state? Absolutely too. So the networks of freedom, the advent of a new society from the power of the mind, creativity, etc., ultimately weakens the democratic state and strengthens the authoritarian state. And one last layer of my analysis. I would say that ultimately at this point, what we are seeing in these particular pandemics, which we are not out of it, remember, is the formation of what I call networks of global destruction. Networks of destruction. Why? Because the kind of what I call inhuman development that we have experienced in the last 10 years in these megapolitan areas, in this destruction of the public system in favor of massive privatization of services, has led to a series of recurrent health crises, which we started to identify 10 years ago. SARS-1, SARS-2, MERS, and Ebola, and many others. These pandemics is simply the worst of a series of pandemics that were knocking the door of the world for a long time. This form of inhuman development is linked to processes of destruction that may create our inability to inhabit the planet. The planet will be okay, by the way, without us. It's us in the planet, which is the problem. And it's very simple. The argument is very simple. Which is pandemics? Well, viruses spread through what? Networks, huh? Networks of interpersonal contact. It's nothing else, huh? Now we have enough scientific evidence. We touch each other, we kiss each other, or we talk to each other close enough. It's through the air, it's aerosols. So, therefore, networks of interpersonal contact and physical contact, and therefore, they become more violent by recurrent contact. Pandemics are networks, clearly speaking. But they are networks that are global, because since we have globalized everything and all the contacts, transportation, human connection, etc., because the difference between the pandemics that existed throughout history is that something starts in Wuhan and in 1 month is all over the world. This is what you call globalization. Moreover, the notion here is that a global digital-based macro network of all activities induces a fast-speed multiple micro networks of contacts between humans. The macro network of the structure of activities ultimately leads to micro networks of humans globally distributed. Of course, the only remedy to block the networks of personal interaction is this is the only remedy for the pandemics. This, on the one hand, means returns to block border crossing, but we cannot. Then, science, vaccines, provisionally halted or is halting the crisis. Not entirely, because uneven global development, and because most of the world are still not able to vaccine. And since we don't have vaccines, will be multiple different strains that will emerge. Today is the Brazilian strain, tomorrow is the South African strain, the other day is the British strain, the other day is the India strain, and we keep going because since we cannot confine the usage of the vaccine to one particular area of the world, and we do not share development with the rest of the world, things keep going and going and going. If you want to really have 90 minutes tonight, I would add that climate change, with all its manifestations, functions also globally through successive networks of destruction and interaction, like mass migrations, different movements of the atmosphere, and scientists have started to establish the connection between the process of climate change and the development of pandemics. We know that this is going on. So, the ensuing crisis may connect to other network crises, like the collapse of the financial markets, sudden mass migrations, which are all network. Catastrophic events can only be avoided if we change social organization. This is the old mantra. And therefore, the regulatory role of the state is crucial. But how you regulate in a network state made of multiple interactions, values, and conflicting projects? For the time being, life is sustained by massive migration of activities to digital networks. This is one thing which the UOC has been incredibly useful for the entire university system. Therefore, there is an acceleration of the digital transition to a fully networked operational structure. But therefore, the logic of exclusion, inclusion in the networks amplifies. Who and what has the right to do teleworking? And therefore, the resistance of identities sharpens. Negationism roots into the assault on reason, negating on the basis of imagined identities, science, and therefore breaking up solidarity. States, under these conditions, withdraw on their territorial logics, in contradiction to the global digital logic that already is the one that operates the planet. And all this in the midst of the crisis of legitimacy, which has been deepened by informational politics and disrupted network social movements. In these conditions, more than ever, we need theory to understand, a grounded theory on the emerging contradictions of the network society. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hola, bona tarda, bon dia, bon nit. Welcome to the round table, this strange round table around the screen that we will hold today to discuss the information age ideas, concepts from 20 years on. I want to start congratulating my colleagues for their 20 years of research at the IN3 here at the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, the UOC. And thank you also to Manuel Castells, Professor Manuel Castells, for your presence and your words in the welcoming of this round table. 20 years ago, the Trilogy, The Information Age, was a useful and urgent tool for social movements, organization. I remember reading and discussing it with my colleagues from Squads and Hack Labs. We felt that the nets were a promise for radical democratization and self-organization. In those times, 20 years ago, all movements and groups became nets. And I remember activists from all over Spain and other countries using, when they came here, the word xarxa every time they came, even if it is not easy to pronounce. It were the promising xarxa times. 20 years ago, the Trilogy, The Information Age, was also a sharp and all-embracing tool for academic analysis of society. I remember reading and discussing it also with Manuel Castells students at the PhD program on Information Society, in which I worked in my first period as a professor at the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. With them, I could understand the ambivalence of the net, because it was also the promise for a more efficient development of neoliberal and globalized capitalism that was spreading its nets all over the world, in collaboration with the state as a machine of domination and promotion. It was spreading its nets in its territories, control legal and illegal activities, values, culture, and also this confusing regime of truth that for me is much more difficult to battle than the specificity of the fake, because fake can be dismantled, but confusion, where does confusion start? As Manuel Castells tells us in his writings, a morphology doesn't explain what happens, but how it happens. It doesn't give us the sense, but the form. That is a social structure that combines in a new way older ones. 20 years later, I am not sure that we grasp the sense of what is going on, not only because of the pandemic, but also because the idea and perception of living in a permanent state of crisis and exception has been normalized. But through Manuel Castells' work, we still have a tool to keep trying. Trying means trying social experimentation and theoretical analysis in front of disorientation and darkness of our times. What we need most now, I think, are tools for understanding. And that means to me not only producing big amounts of knowledge, which is worthless, but giving us the time and the space for thinking, and thinking with others. That means thinking with others against the trend towards the privatization of worlds around the self. And self, we could say in Spanish or Catalan, the I, no, el yo, and lo mismo, el mateix, no, in this double sense of the self. That's why we have with us today different scholars from different places and institutions that will address their points of view on Castells' works and concepts 20 years later. And we will start with their words in a different order that the order you have, those who have the printed program, because we have changed the participation order. So we will start with Fernando Calderón, professor at Argentina's Universidad Nacional de San Martín and Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales, that means FLACSO. Fernando Calderón, I think we will find you through the screen if you are here. Yes, hola. Bienvenido.
Hola. Okay, I am ready. Thank you.
Okay. Welcome.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and congratulations to UOC, INTRI, and particularly to my friend Manuel Castells for this celebration. And to you, Marina, for introducing the table today. Manuel Castells' sociological work has been and is an essential global enterprise interdependent between 10 regions and countries and even localities. It is by definition a sort of living and unfinished cognitive map. A structural historical perspective converging Castells' work, combined with the open theory about the network society and the techno-economy of information and communication, fed certain actors, facts, and process empirically analyzed. His theory is built or modified of a new data is available. It tried to understand the history of power and the numerous cultural orientation of social actors, as well the changes of building autonomy and increasing interdependent world. In such a map, Latin America has always been present. Likewise, the European Union, Africa, United Kingdom, United States of North America, India, Russia, and China. Not only as a state, as Manuel underlined today, in globalization, not only as a state in globalization, but as informational territorialists in globalization. I would like to highlight at least 3 research experiences with Manuel. One, the information age in Latin America. It was a debate with 22 researchers of both of techno-economic, social, ecological transformation, as well the cultural and state transformation in the region. The result, 2 tomes around the different possibility and scenarios of insertion of the region in the global society. Is sustainable the globalization in Latin America? Was the key question that we organized our discussion in 2002. In second place, the different ways of information development. I mean, the relationship between informationalism and the human development approach. It highlights studies of different models of international development of 6 countries in 5 different continents, as well as a theoretical reflection that plays as its axis the idea of a state of the public and concept of sustainable informational human development centered on the dignity of people and human rights. Myself, even, I work the concept of actor agency in information society. In this challenge, I try to connect the social actor conflicts perspective that we work with Manuel and with Alain Touraine with the Amartya Sen concept of capacity of agency. Finally, in third place, the emergence of a new Latin American society in the information age, the collapse of the state and the crisis in the citizen subjectivity that we call Camanchaca. This study was being principally on 11 national case study with a network of researchers of several countries and universities, and of course, an intensive empirical revision, interviews, camp research, and several countries, and at the end, we try to understand the result of the global mutation in the region. In this framework, an underlying transversal issue was the question of time, more precisely of timeless time. This concept that Manuel developed in volume 1 of the Information Age. How the different pre-existent temporality of these societies, particularly in Latin America, coexist with the timeless time of informationalism. However, it would seem to me this tension and connection have become even more complex with the global coronavirus pandemic, a phenomenon that it puts in tension not only global economy and powers, but also human nature versus the nature of the virus, placed on the threat of death at the center of life. And with this, we'll see that globalization itself is being redefining, and unexpected change emerge from such as expected in any serendipity phenomenon. Will it return to normal? What normality are taking about and for whom? What mean normality? The world most certainly will be different, and possibly at its center lies the growth of global risk and uncertainty with a great force. The political change underway in various parts of the world, the conflicts between Israel and Palestine, social protests in Latin America and the United States of North America, the new power of digital public space, the weight and increasing strength both in reality and in the imaginary of science and technology, the increase of the criminal economies, the permanent renewal of financial capital and its links with the pharmaceutical industry, the new role of China, political change in the United States, the new religiosity, the growth and innovation of technology and information company, the new culture of networking, and Manuel underlined, the weakness of the arcane global institutionalization like United Nations. In short, a daily life is changing everywhere, and timeless time is showing new and multiple faces. Castells, Manuel Castells, already has deduced at the time of his book publication 25 years ago, that he says, the annihilation and manipulation of the time by the global capital markets managed electronically are the origins of the new form of this devastating economic crisis that are coming in 21st century. Currently, stock exchange as well as financial and monetary platforms control the health of the world using algorithmic systems and symbolic movements of their capital, increasing subordinating the productive economy in the current pandemic crisis with global effects impacting different dimensions. It will seem that informational capitalism coexists with a new culture, a culture of the eternal associated with death that replaces the ephemeral and redefines the relationship between life and death, the face-to-face order of phenomena is being redefined again. As a global risk with global effects, the COVID-19 pandemic will not solve it nationally or regionally. It will seem that a new uncertain logic has been installed that shows the fragility of the informational capitalism regarding the invisible force of the enigmatic nature and technology. Even the rich of power for him being afraid of death. In fact, I am trying to raise the net of the same informational theory to update it, an issue that is a certainly common classical text in times of uncertainty, like the Castells books that we analyze today. There are some themes with regard to the blending of times that I would like to highlight, particularly in the global Latin America. Our society, in its diversities, was integrated in the informational age through a renewal of informational extractivism and through a technological communication flows and platforms, in particular in the network society. These are societies with predominant pluricentric urbanization, constituted mainly by informal, poor, and marginal sectors, rather than the late industrial societies. There are cities with an important industrial reserve army, but no industry. The questions will then be now how these marginal urban sectors are linked with the timeless time of the new society of post-pandemic network. It is possible to identify specific system forms of linking these complex urban informal systems, not only with the global cultural consumption, but also with the new informational companies, particularly with the participation of the young people who belong to the techno-sociability generation. It is possible, for example, to think of a new type of human development where the link between these two times is one of the key to face permanent change and become one of the strategic sector for social integration, information technology economy. If one analyzes various ongoing experiences in marginal urban, even rural areas, these trends can be glimpsed. In other words, is a creative synergy between informationalism and informal sector possible? Between ancestral times such as the Andean or Mayan times with the timeless time of the network society? It is a new informational environmentalist and post-pandemic ethics possible? I don't know. Or perhaps will be, as Borges, the poet Borges said, that we are already the past that we will be, the elemental dust that ignore us. Or like Manuel told me the other day, now we are the future that we don't want it to be. Thank you. That is all.
Thank you, Fernando, for your words and for expressing this, I don't know, your doubts around this normal fragility or this normalization of fragility we are living in nowadays. Thank you. And we are now hearing or receiving with us Dr. Hana Jalloul from Universidad Carlos III de Madrid. You're here or here. Hello. It's your turn and we hear you. Welcome, Hana.
Hello. Welcome. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well? Yeah?
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Hello. Good evening. I need to say, to specify that my old affiliation was, I'm a Doctor in International Relations, but I was affiliated before at Carlos III University, so I will need to be exact with the words. I just want to say that thank you for the invitation and congrats because of this, the Internet Interdisciplinary Institute, the UOC Research Institute. Thank you, UOC, for this invitation, and my specific hi, hello, and congrats to Manuel, Castells, and all the companions today. Well, I'm going to talk today about Castells' volume, which it is Manuel Castells, this trilogy, this amazing and important trilogy, and the impact it had not only 20 years ago, but the impact nowadays. If you read any of the books of Manuel Castells today, and that were written 20 years ago, you can see that they are completely the events that are happening right now in our world. So this is why it's so impressive and so important. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the incidence and the importance of doing an assessment of the theoretical value of identity in the last 20 years. And we can see this through the books of Manuel Castells. Talking about the specific issue I'm going to treat today about the prevention of radicalization and its relation to identity, I must say that I need to specify some of these terms. When we talk about radicalization, for example, we talk, and it has two different meanings. One involves the acquisition of extreme ideas, cognitive radicalization, and other refers to the turn to violence, or behavioral radicalization allegedly based on these extreme ideas. These two are related but quite distant because many people have so-called extremist ideas, but very few people act on them. Talk of using violence that not necessarily lead to violence. Very few people talking about violence want to use it. Then we have another terms like violent extremism. Violent extremism leading to violence defining as the process of adopting an extremist belief system, including the intent to use, encourage, or facilitate violence in order to promote an ideology, a political project or cause as a means of social transformation. While extremism, for example, doesn't have a general accepted definition like terrorism, but when we talk about extremism, it can be used to refer to political ideologies that oppose a society's core values and principles. In the context of liberal democracies, this could be applied to any ideology that advocates racial or religious supremacy and or opposes the core principles of democracy and universal human rights. The term can also be used to describe the methods through which political actors attempt to realize their aims, that is, by using means that show disregard for the life, liberty, and human rights of others. Well, right now, member states, we are confronted with similar concerns, just as the use, for example, of internet and social media that are being used by terrorist or groups or people that are really becoming extremists or radicalized into violence, or going to violent extremism organizations for propaganda and recruitment processes. We are living some radicalization in prisons and risk of increasing polarization, and more broadly, the undermining of social peace and shared values. And we have main issues in order to analyze this. One is the identity and the feeling of identity of the people that are radicalizing or becoming more radicalizing to extremism that can lead or not to violence, and also the use of the net, which is really worrying. This is why most of the prevention of radicalization processes are going to narratives and combating narratives through the net. This is how important nets are in the world today. When we study the people processes in order to radicalize, we talk about social psychology, we talk about group polarization, group thinking, intergroup, people that want to show that are better than other groups. That it's called reciprocal radicalization. Also, we talk about group perceptions that are affected in a self-serving way by group membership. People tend to identify, attribute, and classify behaviors of members from their own groups more positively than outside group, who they identify as having more negative traits and behaviors. We talk also about the intergroup competition. There often exists an implicit competition between groups and among those who share affinity with the cause and idea. Potentially, members may perceive groups that are more extreme to be more committed and therefore more attractive. This is very important to comment here, because one of the effects in the self-attribution of the identity is being shaped by the concept of identity of the group through the media and through the networks. So this is a very important thing to put on the table. There is an individual also level processes concerning the role of the individual in the radicalization process, perspective from the social and behavioral science that have evolved lately considerably. The role of the individual in terrorism, for example, was assumed to emanate from a mental or personal abnormality. We have seen that this is not real. Empirical research on this question, however, has firmly debunked the notion that only crazy people engage in terrorism, for example, as has just to reveal a meaningful and stable terrorist profile. When we talk about these issues, a more recent line of inquiry looks beyond psychological, psychiatric abnormality to explore how otherwise normal mental state or processes built on characteristics, attitude, dispositions, inclinations, or intentions might affect a person's propensity for involvement with violent extremism and actions. We have to reframe the psychology of people that are getting into more extreme violent attitudes. And this is shaped also by the environment too. Manuel was citing before, was saying about vulnerabilities, and he was talking about marginalization. All these issues shape the role and the perception of a person in order to get much inclined or not to radicalization. And this is important. We find theories as authoritarianism or dogmatism or apocalypticism. This locates the problem of evil in time and looks forward to this imminent resolution, for example, of problems. Which it is important to know is that there is a fundamentalist mindset. The ideas of the radical narrative that provide a filter of understanding the world, the social factors that compel an individual to embrace this radical narrative, psychological factors, characteristic pathologies, and triggers that may prompt an individual to use violence to promote and consummate this narrative. There is mass radicalization conflict with this in and out group. There is a mass radicalization conflict within the group, and this is important to know because this has a great influence on this imaginary identity that this group have of an idea. Radicalization, some authors like Diego said that radicalization towards violent extremism is a complex, multifaceted process that takes place in a variety of levels. The explanation of self-categorization as a core concept of a social science project analyzing the behavior of groups known as the social identity perspective. And this is very important. We have worked, this theory have been worked extensively and deeply by authors such as Jalloul or Tarney, for example. Group bias involved identification with one groups, and these groups identify themselves with an imaginary outgroup outside there. This is important to know because, as I just said, they have an imaginary perception of how groups work outside their environment. I'm gonna put an example about that. This is very, very important. When we talk, for example, about people that have become extremists, more extremists, going into terrorism in Europe, for example, in the last year, I have published that if we circumscribe our analysis, for example, to the European Muslim citizens that became radicalized and committed terrorist acts, we must not ignore the fact that they are European Muslim citizens. That is to say that those individuals who are radicalized towards violence and executed along with terrorist groups advocate a cause that geographically and in some cases culturally is alien to them. We can mention the circumstance of those individuals having or not Arab origins, who have never been in the Arab world in countries such like Syria or Iraq, or which organizations like ISIS raised the capitals of the caliphates in that countries. They identify themselves with causes that are not theirs. There is a misconception of the belonging of identity, belonging. And this is what, because they imagine something is really not existing in their life, but that they think that they belong to. This is also shaped also by the media, the use of networks, and this is very important to analyze. An important factor. Why am I talking about this? Because when reading Power of Identity, first edition 1998 and second in 2003 of Manuel Castells, he was already talking, when we talk about, if we want to be concrete and talking about the processes of radicalization in Arab and Muslim minorities in other parts of the world, in the Middle East and outside of the Middle East, he was talking about the endless crises of the Middle East that are constructed on the basis of conflict, religious identity. He was saying this more than 20 years ago. Manuel Castells was talking about Islamic fundamentalism in all this version is the dominant cultural political trend as the project of a secular Arab nationalistic state collapsed in all the Arab countries, and its successors, like at that time, Mubarak or Gaddafi and Assad's son, had to repress God on behalf of God in order to survive. The media and the concept of identity have shaped in many ways this crisis. Failure of the state that Manuel has mentioned today, and he has been mentioning all along these 20 years, domination, control, surveillance. Somehow this is the root of the sense of marginalization in the Arab world that lead to the phenomenon of radicalization in many collectives, many small communities that have become radicalized in another part of the world. When we talk, I want to specify, I'm talking about here Arab and Muslim communities. So this is the roots that are in the center of all this group radicalization in this collective that were radicalization outside the Arab world and within, and the roots were these ones. First tool to radicalize has been the use of the net and the deep web, and this is why counter-violence extremist policies, many counter-narratives within it, has been specifically tailored to fight and prevent radicalization through the internet. 20 years ago, Manuel Castells was about, for example, Turkey, one of the most populous European countries, has accentuated its Muslim identity, placing its democracy on a collision course with the intransigent secularism embedded in the armed force modeled by Ataturk. This is what Manuel Castells was saying 20 years ago, and you read the book now, and it's exactly what is happening. This is why your book, Manuel, your books are so important to us. This is an indication, and it was at that time, that fundamentalism is not necessarily an exacerbation of religiosity, but an expression of radicalized resistance identity that nets in any cultural form that fits its development. a new order that not only fails to benefit most of the poor of the planet, but also deprive them of their own values. This is what Manuel Castells was saying. So at that time and right now, the growing influence of Muslim fundamentalism, whose root has some characteristics are studies in the volumes of Manuel Castells, continue then and right now in the same line. And it's a way to show how the communities that feel themselves marginalized are not represented by their own states because their states are failed states, are continue to fulfill this marginalization and this sense of the lack of a real proper identity that are considered Arab and Muslim society as a whole, and they do not feel themselves respected by their own states. What he was saying 20 years ago is what is happening right now. Plus all the politics that have been shaped, external politics in the Arab countries have also changed after the revolution of the Arab Springs, and right now the mentality of the Arab people, and have not helped really to that conflict nowadays. What we know is that economic and political interests of different actors in the Middle East are at play in this chain of potential conflicts. You know, with everything happening around in Lebanon, Iranian ayatollahs and Shiite leaders of Iraq, everything has worsened the situation. There is a crisis of political legitimacy that he analyzed then, and he's still analyzing in all his books, Manuel, that has created a vacuum in the mechanisms of political representation and social mobilization that is being filled with identity-based movements. The most important in this case are the religious movements that are affecting people that, you know, are getting extremists or becoming radical extremists. Well, a key conceptual component of the analysis of Manuel Castells, as all you know, it's based on three major forms of collective identities: legitimizing identity, resistance identity, and project identity, all related also to radicalization processes that can lead to violence. Identity based on religion and sometimes on territory. I would not like to stay in this more, but I would like to say something. More than 20 years ago, of the first edition of the Information Age, his books are more alive than ever. Identity is definitely related to processes of radicalization. If we want to prevent some radicalization processes, we need, as Manuel said, to change social organization and the role of the state. But we have to address many facts that Manuel has mentioned, such as privacy. And in this moment that we are just living, in the times of the crisis of legitimacy. Assessments of the theoretical value of identity in the last 20 years, and that Manuel works on his trilogy, is vital to understand marginality, vulnerabilities of some collectives, and minority, specifically for the prevention of radicalization. Do not forget what pandemic have showed to all of us, with no exceptions, is that we are all very vulnerable. You said, Manuel, today that we are not necessarily good persons. Let's gonna think that we are. Let's gonna invest in trying to understand how networks work. This is why your trilogy, Manuel Castells' trilogy, is so important nowadays. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hana. Thank you, Hana Jalloul, for your thoughts on the processes of identification, its dangers, and its strategic potentialities around social and political vulnerability and marginality. Now, we have here, presentially, the only person that is here with us, Diana Roig Sanz, ERC grant holder and ICREA Research Professor at ICREA. So welcome, Diana.
Yeah.
Andaban.
So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. And this must be one of the most trendy and popular sentences in the last year. So thanks to the organizer of this event, Mireia Fernández-Ardèvol and Ramon Rivera, for having invited me to this roundtable to celebrate Manuel Castells' highly influential trilogy on the Information Age and the Network Society. And many thanks also to Marina for having accepted chaired this roundtable. I should start saying that I'm not an expert on communication technology. I'm not a sociologist either, even though I very much appreciate Manuel Castells' work, and I've been also interested in similar issues, mainly on a theoretical and conceptual level. I also spent some time at the Oxford Internet Institute, where Castells was distinguished professor and member of the advisory board. At the Oxford Internet Institute, I deepened my knowledge of the potential intersections between social data science and the humanities, which allowed me to address novel research in my main 3 research lines: global literary studies, sociology of translation, and digital humanities. Today, I will share with you some thoughts that may relate Manuel Castells' monumental trilogy with the research we are carrying out in Globals, the Global Literary Studies Research Lab that I have the pleasure to lead. Let me start reminding that 2 weeks ago, we organized a conference entitled Global Literary Studies Key Concepts, which was targeted through 5 key concepts: space, scale, time, connectivity, and agency. There is no need to say that some of these concepts are key features in Castells' work, as well as they are core concepts in our research. Castells' work has provided us very relevant accounts of the entanglements between the economic and the social, as Pierre Bourdieu or Gisèle Sapiro, key references in my research, did too apply to the literary field and the international book market. By drawing on David Harvey's work, The Rise of the Network Society shed new light on 2 critical features, time and space, by describing how communication technologies propelled markets and production on a global scale. According to Harvey or Castells, space became compressed or annihilated since digital technologies allowed to communicate virtually, a statement that in the last months has more sense than ever before. At the same time, Castells recognized the increasing role of global cities such as New York, Singapore, or London, in which cultures from different parts of the world could meet together in one space and at the same time. Without denying this statement, and by assuming that there are many definitions and nuances related to these concepts, let me focus on my view of space, time, and connectivity applied to literary and cultural production. And I start with space. There is no doubt that we have now a renewed conception of space that encourages a global perspective for communication technology, but also for literature, cinema, art, or translation history to study the complexities of transcultural and transnational relations. The spatial turn places space and movement at the core of many current challenges in a wide range of fields, pushing, in my case, literary and cultural historians to review classical dichotomies such as center and periphery, dominant and dominated, global and local, and north and south. A consensus on the significant role of Southern Europe and non-European regions in modern cultural processes has been established. However, scholars and researchers working on culture in a broad sense are still struggling to conceive space in a new way. We need to challenge the relation between Europe and other literatures worldwide and promote a richer and more complex idea of world and global culture by proposing other terms in the case of literature, such as literature in the world, significant geographies, or translation zones or translation spaces, as I like to say. These terms remind us that even recognizing the impact of the market as well as the effects of political, social, or cultural constraints, we must also bear in mind the specificities of cultural production and circulation in many contexts to understand the complexities of the world literary system and to avoid reproducing the diffusionist perspectives that we try to overcome. Castells' work proposed a dynamic view of geography, space, and time, which I completely share, and he distinguished between a space of place and a space of flows. In this latter case, he pointed out how regions and cities wouldn't disappear, but they were embedded in international networks that enable to connect processes. Thus, we should distinguish between the place of production and the place of consumption, and here is where we may differ slightly. Just to give you an example, in the field of translation and literary studies, many analyses still privilege the North and major metropolis such as New York, London, and Paris as centers of cultural production. However, other cities and megacities worldwide, for example, Guadalajara in Mexico or Beirut in Lebanon, also feature exciting translation and literary scenes and have a meaningful place when it comes to the publishing industry. Beyond their national boundaries, our more common understanding of global cities or cultural capitals in Christoph Schall's terms. At the same time, as Francesca Orsini has underlined, a professor at the University of London, to reflect about world or global literature means to think about a long, complex, and multilingual history, which is not an exception, but a norm that some systemic approaches or mass production analyses have sometimes forgotten. In this respect, she takes on the importance of location and positionality and foregrounds the idea of space through her work on multilingual regions. Thus, if we think about what we can add or nuance to this global framework, but from a local perspective, the role of English becomes less obvious in, for example, theater or poetry, to come back to literary production. Likewise, other features such as multiple trajectories and vantage points and the ideas of plurality or multiple spaces come to the fore. Reflecting about processes of colonialism, English or French were important, but they do not explain everything. And as the geographer Macy would say, we also have to draw our attention to other stories and other trajectories. I come back to the trilogy. Undoubtedly, it's very relevant to look at production, markets, and cultural, social, economic, or political processes, but we should also analyze what they bring and what they make invisible too. Plays for both Harvey or Castells became very relevant in our globalized world, and many cities and regions could bring social, economic, and symbolic capital in Bourdieu's terms. However, if we shift our perspective and vantage point, we can also contribute to break with this idea of innovative centers and imitative peripheries that I have defended many times in my research. We have been told that translation flows between the so-called peripheral cultures occurred thanks to the mediation of central languages, but our research group aims at questioning these channels of transmission. In this respect, one of the greatest challenges that we have ahead is to encourage a decentralized and non-Western and Eurocentric cultural perspective that enables researchers to engage in larger accounts of cultural processes, both geographically and temporally. The network society has been raised thanks to global flows of information that meet in cities or regions, and this is connected with a space of flows in the form of nodes. In the case of global literary production, literature or cultural goods also circulated in what I have called translation flows or translation zones in the case of literature, or significant geographies for Francesca Orsini, as I was mentioning before. Regarding space, literary and cultural historians within both a sociological and hermeneutic approach are also trying to conceptualize a better way to study literature and cultural goods written or made in specific areas not defined through nation-states, but through other geographical or socio-technological criteria such as rivers, mountains, or digital clouds. In terms of scale, we consider different scales in the analysis of cultural and literary developments, since these processes cannot be seen as separately and exclusively local, national, regional, or global, but can instead be analyzed at the intersection of multiple scales. Thus, we have now novel ways to integrate unforeseen layers that allow us to combine local, national, regional, and continental features with a global reach, but also the human and non-human from a Latourian perspective. Another key feature of the trilogy is the concept of timeless time that Fernando was mentioning before. Castells distinguishes the different experience of time for a space of flows and a space of places, which I find particularly interesting. A space of places are less affected by the time dimension of global transformations, while the space of flows is constrained to a timeless time regime. In my research, we stand for multiple temporalities and a flexible periodization of both our objects of research, books, translations, novels, and films, and the spaces of comparison, since global and transnational approaches are sometimes difficult to work with because they have to do with specific national histories that may differ. In this respect, we consider that a longue durée account of how culture and literature in a broad sense circulate or not over time, extending far beyond borders, may help to shed light into the circulation of multiple literary temporalities. Multiple temporalities also affect the ways in which literature, translation, or cinema attempt to account for different time periods and represent time, for example, the future, or greater periods of time that allow us to take an Anthropocene perspective. Finally, global studies have faced the idea of connectivity and movement and hyperconnectivity as a real challenge. In this regard, researchers are still struggling to analyze the existence or lack of relations, flows, circulation, mobility, or displacement that can shed light into processes of cultural, political, economic, or social transformation. And we also try to reflect on the constraints that may impact them. The role of connectivity and the relevance of networks as the emerging form of social organization were at the core of Castells' work, and the new or unknown relations that emerge, as well as the role of connectivity and its uniqueness, are at the core of mine. In this respect, I find important to understand connections as a way to transmit power or exclusion. The mobility of people, cultural goods, and ideas produces common ground, but also produces disassociations and differences. Thus, we can discover how connections, networks, and connectivity homogenize social relations or make them more diverse across the world. Networks and connections help canon literary and art formation, but also encourage mechanisms of exclusion, as can be shown in the study of processes of textual transfer, in translation and reviews, or tracing the heritage that we don't find in national or international museums. Thus, we not only need to push notions such as connections, connectivity, or networks, but also to stress the need for a more analytical focus on the process of movement and circulation, but also non-circulation and displacement, to quote my colleague Aurea Mota. At the core of these interactions, we could also place the idea of relation, impact, success, and failure, and this is used by Modgon, but also the continuities and discontinuities that we see when analyzing connections over time, as in the work by my PhD student, Elisabeth Carbó. Or the idea of cultural transfer by Michel Espagne, after assuming that connections and movement are a prior step. That said, the discussion on impact and success should take us to revise the idea that connections, movements, and interactions may not always involve new and innovative forms, harmonious exchanges, or positive relations. Indeed, we should nuance this idea of circulation or connectivity as a complete and perfect movement without any loss, friction, or addiction. Reflecting on the globalized book market, it has been pointed out the current level of connectivity, but the very consciousness of connectivity and the subjective experience of being connected, and how this also affects the ways in which we understand agency. When we tell that everyone is connected, this means those with whom we are connected. Insights on this regard allow us to recognize circuits of connectivity, and in my field, publishing patterns that explain, for example, why publishers in different countries make similar decisions or publish at the same time. And this has been the work by Andrei Wimmer. Giselle Sapiro's research is also concerned by the economic production of books, consumption, or the globalization of the publishing market, which also shares Castells' view on the pressure of industries to reinvent themselves and reduce the time for decision-making. Relational and data-driven approaches can also enhance more transnational research related to relevant topics such as exile, mobility, displacement, and migration in literary, film, or translation history. Until recently, we lacked the tools to understand, for example, the scope of a transfer's impact. However, we now find ourselves before the possibility of imagining far more complex networks. In our group, we try to reinforce the analysis of connections and interactions between South-South to grasp asymmetry or imbalances in a more complete way. All cases in which an author must be consecrated by a center to get to other spaces are examples of the nonlinearity of cultural transfer. Thus, major contributions should be those meshing new data from a wide range of sources belonging to cultures generally considered peripheral into a more global vision. On the other hand, the analysis of connectivity can also help us to rewrite mainstream history. Undoubtedly, gender biases have caused multiple distortions as women have remained invisible, and we miss many stories of creation and innovation. In our research, Ibero-American women were part of a transnational, multilingual, highly connected and mobile elite, but the role they undertook at their times has been partly forgotten. There is no need to say that in this case, the focus on Ibero-American women, as it happens in many parts of the world, is doubly rebellious, since women have been considered the periphery of the periphery. I share with Manuel Castells' work his view on the study of how centers of cultural production evolved in history, because this will take us to a more nuanced view of what centrality means in relation to its activities, dynamic character, and a long-duration perspective. Finally, thinking about connectivity in our contemporary times should particularly content a new understanding of displacement or out of place, such as exile, migration, or diaspora, as I was mentioning before. Displacement may also refer to the discontinuities of cultural products, literary works, films, translations, practices, concepts, representations, imaginaries, and agents of the literary field. And I get to my conclusions. In the last 25 years, it's clear that internet and globalization processes, economic, political, social, and cultural, transform our lives. But from an academic point of view, researchers are still trying to find new methodologies for the study of their objects of research from a global perspective. In my field, the digital turn in literary studies has provoked a rise of both quantitative and qualitative analysis, but we still try to build a critical, ethical, and interdisciplinary approach that considers multiple disciplines, new technologies, and a more decentered and inclusive approach. This will maybe allow to revert a bit the situation where those in the space of places that have been ignored by global networks in comparison to those living in the space of flows can be more visible and empowered. I will stop here by thanking again your invitation and the opportunity of reading again Manuel Castells' works with more detail. The words I shared with you today bridge Manuel Castells' work with mine, but by sitting here, I also represent to all my colleagues at the IN3, and very particularly to the group leaders. So I will finish thanking Professor Castells for his intellectual and scientific heritage on behalf of Mireia Fernández-Ardèvol, Ramon Rivera, Mayo Fuster, Milagros Sainz, Israel Rodríguez Giral, Xavier Vilallosana, Javier Borge, Ángel Juan, Jordi Cabot, and of course, our director, David Mejías, and myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana Roig, for your research on how to reshape space and cultural geographies and decentralized channels of transmission and connections. Now it's the time for Felix Stalder from Zurich University of the Arts, Professor of Digital Culture there. Welcome, Felix Stalder. You can start when you want.
Okay.
Welcome.
Thank you, Marina, for the introduction, and also thank you for the organizers who managed to keep the ship afloat through lots of storms during the pandemic. As my contribution, I would like to do two things. The first, reflect on the historical moment of the Trilogy's publication 25 years ago, and then draw out how the theory of the network society resonates with my reading of the present context. The Trilogy is a work that appeared at exactly the right time, both for me personally, but also more importantly for the social sciences as an open set of interrelated fields more generally. In 1996, I was a grad student at the McLuhan Center of Culture and Technology at the University of Toronto, working on the relationships of technology and society. Being a grad student, I had plenty of time to read and to engage with new ideas. I did so already with a McLuhanite sensibility, meaning the media's most pervasive influence is by transforming society and by transforming the sense of self, and not by transporting specific types of content. And the Trilogy opens with such a notion, stating, and I quote, "Since technology is society, society cannot be understood or represented without its technological tools." So at the time of publication, I had both time to engage, but already had a good perspective that made it easier to see the underlying threads that structure the book, allowing it to claim a historic unity across contradictory differences. It was an exciting period. I was reading the volumes as quickly as they came out, and so I was able to write one of the earliest comprehensive reviews published in 1998 in the journal Information Society. And it turned out it was my first academic publication. Then in 2006, a book-length assessment of the theory of the network society for Polity Press, which was my first academic book. I learned only much later that my name was put on the shortlist by Manuel himself. And I think it speaks to his intellectual curiosity and integrity that he proposed someone who was still relatively young, totally unknown, and institutionally completely independent of him. But of course, the broader context was much more important. In 1996, the internet, while not yet fully a mass medium, had already been widely available in academia, large businesses, and many government agencies. The dot-com boom was beginning to take off, and the miracles of IT were everywhere in the popular press. The notion that we need to understand the relationship between the social and technological dynamics resonated with that historical moment, as so many new tools were introduced into all levels of society and into the daily lives of a rapidly growing number of people. So the notion that society cannot be understood without its technological tools spoke to that historical moment, and it still speaks to our moment today. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the end of the Cold War was still very much in present memory. Globalization had turned into an everyday reality. And from this, the very basic notions of time and space, both understood as physical space, but also virtual space, and of lived time and organized time, were called into question. For a lot of people, it was clear that something fundamentally was shifting, that something new was taking shape, and a lot of confusing, contradictory, and superficial accounts of what was happening were circulating. And a very popular notion, Manuel alluded to that, was the misguided notion of the end of the nation state. So in this context, the Trilogy appeared. And it spoke to both this sense of historical acceleration and it provided a framework to make sense of it. That was clearly on a different scale and a different level of quality from all the others that were available at the time. In my view, there are really two aspects of the theory that gave the trilogy such a long-standing impact and that established it as a new standard of macro sociology. The first is the theory's holism, and the second is its multiculturalism. Both, I think, are standard today, but they weren't back then. And the fact that they are standard today is perhaps also a testament to the legacy of the trilogy. The trilogy's holism is a social one. It contends that society cannot be reduced to any of its parts, no matter how important that part might be. Rather, there are multiple sources of change which need to be understood, both on their own terms as well as in relation to each other. There is no privileged vantage point from which to understand society as a whole by analyzing a supposed key aspect, be that the economy, politics, culture, or technology. In order to understand one aspect, we have to understand the whole. Yet the whole emerges from a myriad of interdependent events. In the trilogy, this holism is almost fractal, in the sense that even within each of these areas, say the technological development, there are contradictory forces, in this case, economic, academic, creative, and activist forces, creating specific dynamics that are both irreducible to, but at the same time, deeply connected to the wider social dynamics. The trilogy's multiculturalism, on the other hand, stressed that the contemporary social developments cannot be understood in terms of less or more advanced society, all striving to emulate with varying degrees of success a single most advanced model, whether that be Silicon Valley, America, the West, or the East. Rather, the particular character of the network society stems from the interaction of multiple models, each shaped by the historically determined resources that people can draw on in dealing with the challenges and opportunity of a world integrated and fractured as never before. And I think it was this multiculturalism that differentiated the trilogy most deeply from previous accounts of the post-industrial or information society, which tended towards a very narrow Western, sometimes also Eastern focus, and thus often misreading even the Western experience. When looking at the trilogy now, the optimism of the 1990s that permeates the trilogy resonates less. And I don't mean a naive optimism. The trilogy contains many analyses of the dark forces that were also unleashed. For example, the chapter on the American militias reads almost prescient, considering the storm of the Capitol on January 6th of this year. No, the optimism in the trilogy stemmed from the underlying observation that relatively liberal societies in the West and in the East were able to manage the transition from industrialism to informationalism relatively well, upgrade their organizational capacities to a higher level of complexity, not the least because this upgrade could be achieved without challenging the basic structures of capitalism. Capitalism was transformed, but it also expanded and hardened. On the other hand, authoritarian governments collapsed precisely because they could not manage such a transition within their overall political and organizational paradigm. This optimism, Manuel alluded to that in his introductory remarks, is much harder to sustain today. Not only because authoritarian actors, both outside and inside democracies, have managed to adapt quite successfully to the informational paradigm and use a kind of negative networking to their destruction, a kind of negative networking that Manuel just called the assault on reason. But more importantly, it seems to me, it is very clear that we are standing at another moment of profound social transformation due to the very concrete experience of overstepping the geophysical boundaries of Earth, undermining the conditions of large-scale civilizations, at least as we have known it historically. The pandemic is a zoonotic event made more likely by the ever-increasing pressures on natural resources and the encroachment of wild habitats. And this is yet another sign of the unsustainability of the current mode of development. If we look how Western democracies have handled this event, it is hard to conclude that they were strengthened by it and that they are well prepared for the next one that is likely to follow. So this time, against the horizon of ecological disaster, it seems that Western liberal societies are not particularly capable of managing the necessary transformation, in part because it's not clear if this can be done without challenging the basic structures of capitalism. So from this vantage point, it is very interesting to reread, for me, the chapter in the trilogy which impressed me personally the least 25 years ago, that is the chapter on the collapse of the Soviet Union. We can read it today as an example of a failed transition, an analysis of systemic blockages and misaligned incentives that made it impossible to adapt, even though everyone knew that the dominant paradigm was no longer up to the task, and the negative feedbacks in terms of Chernobyl or the lost war in Afghanistan were becoming stronger and stronger. The cultural history of the late Soviet Union, which is only alluded to in Manuel's chapter, gives us an example of a collective experience not unlike our own. Everybody knows that the situation is unsustainable, but nobody can imagine its end. And I think this situation has also an impact on the kind of theory we need today. At the end of the trilogy, Manuel reflected on the role of the theory, and let me quote this. Each time an intellectual has tried to answer this question and seriously implement the answer, catastrophe ensued. In the 20th century, philosophers have been trying to change the world. In the 21st century, it's time to interpret it differently. Hence my circumspection, which is not indifference, about a world troubled by its own promise. Of course, I fully agree that implementing an intellectual program directly as politics has a terrible track record and should not be done again. But simply interpreting the malaise, I think, is not enough. I think theory needs to become more imaginative again. Of course, it needs to be rigorously rooted in an understanding of the structures of the present, yet it needs to be able to envision alternative trajectories, to create a new sense of how our being in the world can allow us to think beyond the current impasse and step back from the brink of self-destruction that we stand on today. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix Stalder, for your questions on this optimism of the 90s, these promising Sharsha times, I said before, these net times where that it was I was wondering now, it was a really strange optimism because we didn't have really a clear image of the future, but I think we felt something was being open, and perhaps it's what we now don't feel. But it is strange that the 90s came after the dark 80s, no? And I think it would be interesting to rethink now what happened that could make us feel that something started after the finishing of other emancipatory imaginations. So thank you. We'll receive now Ida Sasser, Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at Hunter College and CUNY Graduate Center. Welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Okay. Well, I guess I'm not that much more cheerful than Felix or even than Hana for that matter. But at least I'm more ambivalent in this paper about the situation and the future. Firstly, I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak at this panel and Marina for being a chair. After the trials of the last year and a half, it's amazing to me that we are here together, at least in spirit, if not in the same place. But I would prefer to be in Barcelona, actually. Anyway, I'm honored to be invited to celebrate the work of Manuel Castells. And particularly honored to note that when the first volume of the Network Society was published in the United States, it was launched by the anthropology department and the people in the university at the CUNY Graduate Center. For that reason, where I was teaching. For that reason, among many, I feel very privileged to be able to be present for the 25th anniversary. It was inspiring then, and his work has been central, certainly to all kinds of social sciences, but of course, to much anthropological work. In fact, his work had been central even before the trilogy and inspired a number of different researchers. And certainly I have learned from it and been inspired from his work for many, many decades. In his trilogy of the Information Age, Castells set the stage for the systematic analysis of the global. His vision of the network society in the Information Age went far beyond the under-theorized terms, such as globalization, which were commonly being used, and the trilogy became a key text to explain the new era that we were entering. I think everybody, that was what was on people's minds. What was going to happen, I think Felix just pointed that out. To go back even further for the roots of some of these ideas, in 1984, I was part of a series of seminars that Manuel organized and led, 3-year-long paradigm-changing series, which with key analysts of New York City, you would know their names maybe, but they were all very famous in themselves, Marshall Berman, Jana Abelugard, the Feinsteins, etc., discussing the future of New York City and the changes. Castells analyzed the transformation of what was initially named the dual city as New York lost its port and small industry fundamentals and developed the high-tech headquarters, migrant service workers, and homelessness by which it is characterized today. This analysis of the changing city provided the testing ground for understanding the global changes, which the trilogy later amplified greatly and looked at the global and illuminated. By the publication of his first global volume, The Network Society, Castells had integrated his urban theory into a much broader analytical perspective, which allowed him to elucidate the workings of a global network based in the nodes of the informational cities such as New York City, Tokyo, and other Western centers, but also, importantly, including urban nodes or outposts of global capital and elite formation throughout the world. He had a very different vision of class and colonialism than what was really around at that time. He reconfigured analytical understandings of inequality, recognizing the powers of network connections as they had been generated by the information technology accelerated in corporate headquarters in New York City and elsewhere, and clearly noted the powerlessness created by exclusion, which we now label the digital gap. Today, I would like to consider the arguments in Volume 2, The Power of Identity. This was not Castells' first theorization of social movements. We can see the urban question, even, as an analysis of the political momentum of May '68 and the demonstrations of that time, which changed urban studies for generations. Manuel Castells, David Harvey, Lefebvre, everybody was talking about that. It was about the urban question was about the class conflict reflected in the concrete pavements of cities. However, it was an essentially structural analysis, and the city and the grassroots was Manuel's first theoretical approach to social movements, based on historical and ethnographic analysis, and demonstrating to me, which others have mentioned, the brilliance of his prescriptive, the work he did, the detailed ethnographic and reading and incredible thinking has allowed him to be amazingly understanding parts of the future, not everything, but really prescient, I feel. And I feel it comes from the detail in which he works on the ground, as well as his larger theoretical comprehension. In the city and the grassroots, Castells recognizes transformative social movements from the Paris Commune as a municipal rebellion to Glasgow rent strikes, where he recognized the importance of social reproduction and women in social movements, and Latin America rescates to Spanish environmental movements and neighborhood movements in San Francisco, particularly those, not only the ones which we now call Latinx mission movements, but also around sexuality and the gay rights, gay housing, etc. The Castro. Castells does not claim an end to the significance of class, but neither does he insist on the primacy of class, and sees transformative possibilities in identity movements, movements around housing, and also environment in the city. In all these cases, the power of Castells' insistence in starting with the concrete and generating theory from data and evidence is very crucial. As Castells predicted in The Power of Identity, there is no question that new kinds of movements have emerged in relation to the network society and the information era. And they have been facilitated by more and more mobile and sophisticated communication networks. And he also, as people have mentioned, and Hana mentioned, and Felix mentioned, the movements from the right, the militia, he didn't only look at the emergence from the left, he looked at the power of networks to transform all kinds of movements, for good and for bad, I would say. That's rather unnuanced. My own research has been focused on social movements, first in the late 1970s among working class people demanding public services in New York City, as it was transformed, as I mentioned, from a working class city to an ever more unequal gentrified city with unaffordable housing and investment in high tech and tourism. Then I worked in Southern Africa with the global movement for HIV treatment and looking at the politics of global demands for HIV treatment. And recently, the squares or Occupy mass mobilizations, and now in France among the Gilets jaunes is the latest thing I did. Throughout, I have been inspired by the vision and brilliance of Manuel's work. Since the Gilets jaunes are the latest and to me the most enigmatic of movements, I will concentrate here on briefly outlining some thoughts about the Gilets jaunes. Starting in November 2018, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, demonstrations in France reoriented the political arena and precipitated a series of mass protests among unions, pensioners, and others, which had not been anticipated at all before they came on the scene. I went to Paris, I said, where are the social movements? People said, don't come here, go to Spain, look at the famous. The Gilets jaunes were recognized in France and internationally as very different from the Occupy movements, which mostly occurred in 2011 as a response to the Great Recession of 2008. The Gilets jaunes arrived in the era of Brexit and the election of Trump. In the fall of 2018, it was not clear if they were from the right or from the left, assuming that those categories still hold. I hope that these findings contribute to a general discussion of social movements and the particular characteristics of this new era of left-right blurring. Over the COVID-19 year, the Gilets jaunes took some interesting stands, although the jury on left and right may still be a little bit out. And that's what I want to talk about: COVID, police brutality, and race, and French mobilizations in this context. On May 31st, 2020, the US exploded in protest to address the super-exploitation of racism, which has uniquely scarred its history. This was followed by international demonstrations, including massive demonstrations in Paris against police brutality. Police violence had become a common theme of the Gilets jaunes, who had initially been astonished by the heavy police assaults on their demonstrations. Many Gilets jaunes had been mutilated and even killed by police violence. They had actually lost eyes, hands, and feet from the use of a form of rubber bullet launcher, in which ball-shaped projectiles are shot out of specialized handheld launchers. This is banned in most other countries, many of them. And a protester had died after being hit by a tear gas grenade. The Gilets jaunes had organized many protests against police violence and in support of their wounded members. However, in May 2020, the Paris protests, which included the Gilets jaunes, focused specifically on the brutality against youth and people of color. In these surprising new developments, we saw an international mobilization, which perhaps momentarily broke through some of the fragmentations of the working class between so-called but no longer stable working classes, which really are more like the Gilets jaunes, the imagined middle classes, also at risk of instability, and the super-exploited subjects divided by racism, sexism, colonialism, citizenship, and other forms of historical subordination. And obviously, they're responding to 5 decades of austerity policies, not just 2008. As Castells notes, the state has not been weakened, but it has been restructured over the last 50 years. The long-term neoliberal assault has precipitated a widespread destruction of a particular kind of state, as well as the restructuring of global power networks, and as we saw, surveillance that Manuel mentioned. The industrial state underwrote the corporate world by subsidizing the education, health stability of a large proportion of workers. 20th century worker struggles established the particular forms of social reproduction reified in the welfare state, including the patriarchal heterosexual family. However, the stable working class emerged alongside and in interaction with lower and precarious standards of reproduction for minorities, migrants, and other subordinate groups, and women, as well as the uneven development of post-colonial. The massive assaults of neoliberalism destroyed the lives of displaced industrial workers and further devastated minority, immigrant, and native communities in the US. Under COVID, both in France and more drastically the US, these losses, long manifest in differential mortality rates, have become immediately visible life and death issues. Although I actually studied HIV, and the same process occurred in the 1980s and 1990s in the first decades of HIV, that was more protracted, as well as made invisible by stigma. In addition, the neoliberal degradation of state services since then has progressed much further. In the shifting global power configurations, contemporary nation states no longer protect the stability of the traditional working class. The emergence of different forms of social movements can be seen as an attempt to redress the assault on customary living conditions, life cycle security, and aspirations. I would suggest that this is also an attempt to redefine workers to include the previously neglected minorities, as well as new family and identity configurations. As Castells foresaw in The Power of Identity, the changing structures of patriarchy and sexuality. New forms of worker protection have to consider new forms of relationship within families, as well as new kinds of work leisure routine and the changes in time that people have mentioned. The first demonstrations that occurred in France 5 years ago was something called Nuit debout. That was in 2016. And it was largely a big city, youth-led, leftist Occupy Squares movement. The next major mobilization was that of the Gilets jaunes. The Gilets jaunes were recognized as a new phenomenon as they came from the urban peripheries of Paris and throughout the provinces. not regarded as cosmopolitan. They included many teachers, nurses, social workers, as well as truck drivers, chefs, construction workers, and service workers in general. Many were middle-aged, and some were thought to be right-wing. They initially objected to a measure that was said by Macron to be ecological, that targeted the cheaper fuel for an extra tax, and that poor people in the urban peripheries were particularly dependent on this fuel for their old cars and their daily commutes. Contrary to stereotype and the government portrayal of the demonstration, Gilets jaunes insisted that they did not object to environmental concerns. They organized protests in collaboration with climate activists to demonstrate their common concerns and the support of the Gilets jaunes for the environment. A frequent ongoing chant was, "We care about the end of the month and the end of the year, the end of the world, I'm sorry, the end of the month and the end of the world, convergence, everything together." The first email call to protest the fuel tax was 2018. So it's email. Later, Facebook posts and connections multiplied. However, protests were local. They were based on community locales such as cabanas that people built, roundabouts, and a generation of social solidarity on the immediate level, while connecting heavily through Facebook and every other kind of app you can think of, which they were concerned very much about surveillance, so they kept switching the apps. People were concerned with the degradation of public services, the privatization of healthcare, and their own daily challenges, as well very much as what they saw as the decay of democracy. And they frequently described the lack of investment in public transportation of outside Paris and provincial services as stealing of the state. They saw their public services as a right, and they owned state services, and they said that privatization was stealing the public money. And the destruction of the state, as I saw it, was manifest not only in the privatization and dismantlement of public services, but also in the isolation and crisis of daily life, the family, education, healthcare, the aged, the handicapped. The handicapped came on all those protests with their wheelchairs. And the students who feel they are, quotes, losing their futures, as one protester said to me. The Gilets jaunes linked many of the uprising and strikes from different sections, such as railroad, teachers, and health workers, and the smaller uprising among hospital aides or the sans-papiers, as well as the climate change activists and left-wing organizations, not concentrated in the workplace, although participating in many disparate strikes. The Gilets jaunes invented new methods, like the occupation of roundabouts, the building of cabanas, and the freeing of toll booths. In these ways, the Gilets jaunes were attempting to forge a new set of resistance and generating the support of the public. And they also used a lot of filming and put every film of everything. They made their own media. They didn't trust the media. And so they filmed everything. There were people with cameras every 20 yards. And all of that went up on Facebook. And that is continuing in France with all the demonstrations that have followed. Made up of working class people on the urban periphery, including many pensioners and families who could not make ends meet, the Gilets jaunes were crafting an emerging oppositional bloc. The pension protests in Paris followed the Gilets jaunes a year later, when strikers closed down the metro and the buses, and then different sectors from healthcare workers, legal professions, social services, organized massive strikes and demonstrations until the shutdown of the COVID in March 2020. The Gilets jaunes, among the grassroots union members, in many ways had forced the unions to take up more militant positions against the pension changes. As all the different groups marched in massive protests through Paris, Gilets jaunes, yellow vests, could be seen populating the street protests of every profession in their distinctive yellow jackets and with personal statements in black on their backs, black ink. The signature song of all the pension protests was that of the Gilets jaunes, as were many of the chants and banners. In France, Nuit debout, the Gilets jaunes, the pension strikes, and many other movements represent transformative spaces, local solidarity, street presence, street humanity, linked through the internet. So people meet each other, they exchange Facebook, they exchange everything right away, as soon as they meet the person, if they think they're part of the or other people in the street. In the current, where people in the current era of financialization are struggling to work out new strategies. Activists envision horizontalist movements, as in Occupy, as an effort to develop innovative forms of protest to counteract the increasing inequality, authoritarian tendencies, and hardened boundaries of the new global regime, just in the way that Manuel wrote about the squares of 2012 and 2011 and 12. Such progressive representation strives for inclusivity and the breakdown and recognition of established hierarchies of gender, race, immigration, and class, among others. Each of these groups has to be understood in the context of their own history and social movements. The participants in Nuit debout were not the same as the Gilets jaunes. However, in France and elsewhere, multiple subaltern groups may be beginning to recognize themselves as part of a larger political bloc in opposition to the destruction of the welfare state and degradation of democratic representation. Such movements are contingent and contested, reflected of the same rage against the destruction of living standards and aspirations for a generation as the right, but offering hope for more inclusive solutions. So I think, we know some of the right-wing militias and the Trumpites and Brexit. As noted above, the Gilets jaunes had been protesting the violence of the police against their street demonstration for almost 2 years. It was a crucial development that in June 2020, they joined ranks with protests against police brutality and racism that were rocking the world. At this particular conjuncture, after the shocking COVID shutdown and the disproportionate deaths of people of color in France and elsewhere, the displaced workers of the urban periphery have joined directly with the super-exploited immigrants, refugees, and previously colonized people of color from banlieue in several unprecedented massive demonstrations. And they also have joined the movement against the new law that prevents the filming of what the police are doing, that was filming a director of color in an elevator who was being beaten up. And then now they have a new law that you can't film the police. However, such a coalition is certainly fragile. Troubling such a development is the submission of the unions for the Gilets jaunes, accompanied by many Gilets jaunes rejection of the unions, as actually some of the occupiers. Some protesters, if unions and labor organization are central to the idea of progressive, these kinds of altercations undermine perspectives of the Gilets jaunes as left. Nevertheless, cooperation with strikes and labor support have been fundamental to the Gilets jaunes movement, getting up at 6 a.m. to help the bus strikers, etc. In the complex political economy of the current moment, when the 99% may be better characterized by debt than by labor, the characteristics of left and right-wing movements and even the definitions of left and right policies require much scrutiny and rethinking. However, a newly popular radio station in France, C Radio, has been discussed as the equivalent of Fox News, the most right-wing organ of Trump, with fast-talking commentators adopting racist and anti-immigrant rhetoric, accompanied by very few facts. Although radio is not exactly a new platform, it may be taking on more power in this atomized, isolated situation of networks. It has been suggested that some Gilets jaunes are said to be turning to this toxic channel affiliated with a party of the extreme right, led by Marine Le Pen. I'm not sure about that, because I've checked the Facebooks of people I know and it doesn't reflect that. But this is what it's saying in the news. As Karl Polanyi wrote about the early 20th century, rage against the disastrous failures of neoliberalism could be expressed in brutal and fascist ways. The post-COVID protests of June 2020 onwards were a hopeful sign in their inclusive, progressive moments, bringing together many groups who were all at risk in different ways and at different levels or aspects of exploitation. They were demanding a rebalancing, such as Manuel talks about, of the destructive neoliberal assault in the past 50 years. However, it is still not clear that this momentary inclusive but also uneven critical community will endure to serve as an antidote against the growing fury, which is fueling nationalism and exclusivism in many countries today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ida Sasser, for recalling that nets are not only digital, but embodied in social practices, collective fights, and urbanistic conditions. We are running out of time, so we'll let the last word and participation to John Thompson, Professor of Sociology and Emeritus Fellow of Jesus College, University of Cambridge. It will be the last participant. Hello. We won't have time for debate, I'm sorry, after all participations, but we are glad to receive you. So welcome, John Thompson, and it's your turn. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this. It's a great honor to celebrate Manuel's great trilogy. In my view, one of the classics of modern social science. In my view, Manuel has done more than anyone else in any discipline to think through the implications of the great technological revolution of our time. And his trilogy remains an indispensable reference for anyone who wants to understand our world today. Now, one of the consequences of coming at the end of a workshop, an event of this kind, is that, of course, we've had many wonderful talks by many distinguished scholars, and they have said many of the things that I too would wish to say. Moreover, we are running out of time, so we don't have a lot of time for me to go into detail on anything. I will be brief. I will offer a few reflections on what I see as the significance of this trilogy from the point of view of someone who works in the field of Anglo-American sociology. And I should say that when I refer to trilogy, I'm really referring, as Manuel said earlier on, not just to the 3 volumes, but also to the 4th volume that appeared in 2009. I think of it as a tetralogy. The 4th volume, Communication Power, in my view, an absolutely fundamental work for the social sciences. So what's so special about this trilogy or tetralogy from the perspective of someone who works in Anglo-American sociology? There are many things that I could say here, but I just want to focus on 2. Again, I will echo some of the things that were said by Felix and Ida and others. One thing that I want to stress is its prescience. And second, what I'm going to call its open-minded grasping of the new. The trilogy was prescient because it was the first major attempt by a social scientist to make sense of the great social transformations that were reshaping our world in the last 2 decades of the 20th century and have continued to reshape our world in the first 2 decades of the 21st. So much has happened over the last 25 years that it's almost hard for us today to remember or even imagine what the state of intellectual debates was like in the late 1980s and early 1990s. There was, as several people have said, a lot of talk at the time in both sociology and the social sciences about globalization. Manuel was by no means the first social scientist to highlight the importance of globalization. But within sociology and the social sciences, there was much less attention being given to the changes in information and communication technologies that were being driven by developments in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. In fact, no one was paying that much attention to this. No one was trying to think through the connections between globalization and the digital revolution, connect up the dots, as it were, and try to understand how these 2 forces were combining to transform our societies our economies, and our politics. The signs were there, but they needed to be interpreted by someone who had the intellectual range and perceptiveness to see that what was taking shape in the 1980s and 1990s was not just a continuation of things as they had been, but was the creation of something new that would change the way that we lived our lives in the 21st century. And in this sense, these books were enormously prescient. Well before anyone else in the social sciences, Manuel saw that these developments were changing our societies in fundamental ways. Things that we now simply take for granted, like the importance of digital technologies and the internet, were not at all obvious in the 1990s when the internet was in its infancy. And it is to Manuel's enormous credit that he saw the real significance of these developments well before anyone else. And this brings me to the second thing I want to say about the trilogy, what I called its open-minded grasping of the new. There is a strong tendency in the social sciences to downplay the novelty of the present and to view new developments through lenses that are shaped by theories and concepts that are deeply entrenched in our disciplines. Sociology, politics, economics, they all do it. They interpret what's happening today by seeing it largely as a continuation of structures and processes that have been shaping our societies for a long time. It's really hard in these disciplines to say, look, what's happening today is really new, and we'll never understand it if we think it's just a continuation of the past. And it was this willingness to look at the societies that were taking shape in the 1980s and 1990s in an open-minded way, and the boldness to say that what was emerging was something new, that is, I think, the real contribution and lasting legacy of the original trilogy. Here was someone who was willing to say that the information and communication revolution was creating a new kind of society, the network society, in which forms of social organization and the exercise of power were being structured in new ways. Manuel helped us to see we couldn't just apply our old concepts to this new world and hope to make sense of it. Instead, we had to come up with new concepts that were tailored to the new social realities that were taking shape around us. And there's more to it than this. Most academic disciplines are pretty conservative in intellectual terms. Even a discipline like sociology that likes to think of itself as avant-garde, in touch with current developments. Most academics tend to remain locked in their traditional paradigms, and they're very reluctant to accept that they might have to change the way they think and change the way they teach in order to take account of new social forms and structures that are emerging. I knew this from my own experience. In the 1980s and early 90s, I was arguing that sociology needs to recognize that information and communication processes have played a fundamental role in the shaping of modern societies. But it was very hard work to make that case. And it's still very hard work. Many of my colleagues, I would say most of them, just don't want to know. And when I tried to set up a course on media and communications at Cambridge, I faced a huge amount of resistance. So I know very well how reluctant our established disciplines are to change their ways of thinking. And when I first read Manuel's trilogy at the end of the 1990s, it was a breath of fresh air. Here was a sociologist who was looking at what was happening with open eyes and prepared to say, wake up, sociologists and others. You need to see that the world taking shape around us is new and different in certain ways. And as scholars and academics, we have an obligation to come up with new ways of thinking and new theories and concepts to make sense of this world and where it was heading. And of course, Manuel was right. In this respect, he was a true intellectual innovator, a pioneer in his own way. And to be honest, he was pretty much on his own, at least within the more established disciplines of the social sciences. It's very easy to forget this today, 25 years later, because now we all know how important these transformations have become. But none of this was at all obvious in the 1980s and early 90s. And Manuel was one of the very few social scientists who saw this with real clarity. Now, as we all know, the Trilogy dealt with lots of different issues. Its very breadth and comprehensiveness, as people have described today, was part of its strength. The central concept was, of course, the concept of the network society, which he used to describe this new kind of social structure that was being brought into being by the interrelated processes of globalization, the information and communication revolution, and the emergence of social movements that were part of a new culture of freedom and autonomy. But the real heart of this account, and the heart of Manuel's work throughout his career, as I see it, was a new way of thinking about power, about how power was exercised, by whom and by what means, how power relations were both reproduced and contested over time, and how all of this was being reshaped by the new social structures of the network society. It was another decade before Manuel presented this network theory of power, as he called it, in more detail, with the publication of Communication Power in 2009. But many of the elements of this theory were already there in the earlier Trilogy. Already in the first volume, Manuel had made the point that information and communication circulate primarily through the media system, and its politics becomes increasingly played out in the space of the media, which increasingly means both traditional media systems and new communication systems associated with the internet. I think Manuel was absolutely right about this. And his analysis of the transformation of politics in the network society overlapped with some of the arguments that I was thinking about and developing at the same time about the mediatization of politics and the rise of political scandal. The way that Manuel developed his analysis of the changing relationships between information and communication processes, power, and politics is, in my view, one of the most important fundamental contributions of his tetralogy, and one that remains more relevant than ever today as we struggle to make sense of a world in which powerful new players, new tech giants, are now shaping the space of information and communication flows in ways that are both unprecedented and largely opaque. And so, in the interest of brevity, I will draw this to a close by offering a brief reflection on what seems to me to be a gap in Manuel's work on power in our digital age. And here I will pick up and echo some of the comments that Manuel himself made right at the beginning, because actually Manuel is his own best critic in many ways. He sees the limitations and gaps of his own earlier work with great clarity. So I will reflect and pick up and reflect on a few of them, some of the issues that he and I have discussed in some detail over the last decade or so anyway. I completely agree with Manuel that we need to rethink our ways of conceptualizing power to take account of the new developments that are shaping our world today. But I'm not sure personally that the network theory of power is going to be enough here. And I'm not sure Manuel succeeds in bringing out with sufficient clarity what I would call the dark side of the digital revolution. It's not just that his account of the democratizing and empowering potential of new communication media is too optimistic, though it undoubtedly is. And Manuel himself has alluded to the fact that he was perhaps a little bit too embedded in the optimism of the Californian culture of freedom and autonomy that was so prevalent in Silicon Valley at the time. But more importantly, it's that the real basis of the power that is now wielded by the tech giants that have come to dominate the space of information and communication flows in our world is left unclarified, or at least inadequately clarified. In my own work on the digital revolution, which I've been developing over the last decade or so in my work on the publishing industry, I've come to the view that we need to give much more attention to the new and distinctive kind of power that the large tech companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and others now exercise. And I don't think, unless I'm mistaken here, I don't think the notion of network power is going to do the trick. Because when you look at these companies, you see that their power is based on a new kind of resource that they systematically accumulate and use to their advantage. This resource is user data, as Manuel himself alluded to earlier, or what I would call information capital. And the tech giants turn this resource into a distinctive form of power that we could call data power, where, of course, AI becomes a key factor, as Manuel himself indicated, in analyzing this user data and enabling it to be commodified in various kinds of behavioral futures markets, as Shoshana Zuboff would say. By accumulating large quantities of user data or information capital, then trading this in online advertising markets, the tech giants have been able to generate vast financial rewards and create effective online monopolies, influence also the attitudes and behaviors of millions of people around the world. So the onus is on us today, and I would say this in a spirit of collaboration and shared interest in mutual understanding, to look again at the ways in which the power structures of our contemporary world are being shaped by the new forms of capital and power accumulated by the large tech companies, and how this power is now being exercised through new forms, new channels, and with new effects. And I would hope very much that this would be seen, this kind of renewal of the great enterprise that Manuel undertook with the original Trilogy and Tetralogy, the renewal of that enterprise in the 2020s, the decade of the 2020s, would be seen as a continuation of his great work in the spirit of his same work, adapting and developing concepts, the new world that we face today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John Thompson, for your thoughts on change and the new, how to think the new in the rigidity of academy. Now, the rigidity of time is cruel, so we are, as I said, out of time. We don't have time for debate, for replies. It would be great. Nets, perhaps, maybe are flexible, screens are not, and time is less. So we will have the last words now from Manuel Castells, and then from our rector too, to close this session.
My dear colleagues, I'm sure that the effort you had put into this, you are all tired, so I'm not going to aggravate the situation. It's simply to take 1 minute to thank you from all my heart the interest and the contribution that you have made. I have learned very much in this session, and you are all right. I'm going to redo a lot of things because I am not finished. Thank you.
And now, Professor Planell, Rector of Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, will say some closing words.
Hello, good evening. First of all, let me thank all the Professor Castells and all the speakers for this great session, inspiring session. As you know, we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the IN3 And the celebration was exactly to have this, this seminar or this event today. So thank you very much to all of you for the effort you have been putting to set up this meeting. And then now let me start in the proper way. So first of all, Professor Castells, and now Minister, Director of IN3, members of the Executive Board, researchers, ladies and gentlemen. In 1976, Nature published an opinion article titled "No University Without Research." It included a warning to the Open University that no higher education institution could focus solely on education because it is the interaction and synergy with research that both characterizes it as an institution and guarantees the quality of its teaching. In short, research is not the only factor, but in terms of universities, it is compulsory, it is necessary. There has been a reassertion of the vital need for research to take its proper place alongside teaching. That's what the quote. Obviously, this article was not talking about the UOC. It didn't exist. Rather, its British namesake, founded in 1969, which, following these warnings, was able to correct its course. We did not need any of this warning here at the UOC. The very decree founding the university a quarter of a century ago explicitly stated that research was essential. And 5 years on from the walk, the founding of the Internet Interdisciplinary Institute, IN3, reinforced the university's commitment to research. The IN3 was pioneering in research into the interactions between digital technologies and human activity. This focus, which at the time was as original as it was disruptive, was aided by the involvement of our colleague and friend, the researcher and now Minister, Professor Manuel Castells. He was a founder and later a director of the Institute. But above all, he was a researcher and an inspiration. The history of the IN3 is intertwined with his name and his research. In these first 20 years, the IN3 has consolidated its position of leading research, not only within, but also beyond the UOC, especially in the field of the network society. Right now, the IN3's different research groups produce a third of the UOC's articles each year, are awarded half of the external research funding, and in 2020 alone organized some 50 activities involving 4,500 people from around the world. Looking beyond the numbers, which you can find in the Institute's reports, I would like to highlight its role as a trailblazer, spearheading progress, opening the way, and being the vanguard in order to go further, always through excellence. The success of the initial approach and the consistent progress since have acted as both an example and an inspiration for others. The IN3 studies the interaction between technology and human sciences, and each step forward has been the result of a natural evolution. From that first core focus on the effects of technology on society, different lines have emerged focusing on the new areas of research and innovation. The interaction between technology and teaching led to the creation of the eLearn Center. The coming together of technology and health prompted the creation of the eHealth Center. And the links between technology and the arts and creativity led us to recently unveil ACTE, our Art, Science and Technology Hub. This institutionalized research has also branched out into other groups and individual researchers who have drawn inspiration from the information age trilogy to pursue rewarding research of their own. In short, The institutions, the groups, and the individuals' research all share a common principle, a commitment to research and knowledge. This commitment was true for the UK's Open University in 1976, as I said earlier. It was also true 20 years ago, as the IN3 made its first steps, and is still true for the present and the future. It is true for the challenges set by the 2030 Agenda and for the crisis brought on by the pandemic. It is true because, as Mariana Mazzucato, economist and the UOC's next honorary doctorate, said recently, it is not enough to get back to normal, we need to build back better. So the current digital transformation represents an excellent opportunity, given that, as anyone who has tried to turn back the tide knows, that the wisest way to get ahead is to ride the waves. The Catalan university system in general, and the UOC in particular, have made a clear commitment, and despite the difficulties, we have stayed the course. Evidence of this can be found in the strategic plans rolled out in the last few years and in our recent performance. As a unique institution and a hub in a global system, we want to play an active part in the future of digital transformation, putting ourselves in the shoes of the people studying, training, upskilling, researching, and showcasing this research. In short, people creating tomorrow's world. And this, in good part, is what the IN3 has been doing for the last 20 years. And that's what Professor Manuel Castells has inspired us. And may they continue to do so for many years to come. Thank you very much.
Aquí també aplaudeixen.